Welcome to today's BSI webinar entitled The Process Approach, the Effective Application in Aerospace. Apologies for the brief delay joining this morning. In an effort to minimize background noise, we have muted all phone lines. As always, we encourage questions and comments throughout the presentation using the chat box located on the left-hand side of your screen. This applies to any technical assistance you may need, as well as submitting questions which will be answered at the end if time permits. All of today's participants will receive a link to enroll for a recording of today's webinar. Lastly, we ask you to participate in a brief survey following the web conference. We appreciate your feedback and your suggestions to improve our future conferences. Before I turn it over to our presenter, allow me a few moments of introduction. Today's webinar will be led by Brendan Hill. Brendan has been in aviation and engineering for 40 years, including 26 years as a British Army officer and aircraft engineer, and serving in many areas of operation as well as in quality management roles. Brendan is BSI's global head of aerospace. He has been in business assurance and certification for over 10 years and has developed BSI services for the aerospace clients. He has also worked in the industry as a group quality manager for 3 factories, 2 CNC manufacturing plants which supplied aerospace, as well as other sectors such as oil and gas, and 1 producing manufacturing software. I will now turn it over to Brendan. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and hello everybody. I hope you can all hear me clearly, because most of you, I guess, are in the US and I'm over the other side of the pond in the UK. So hopefully we can have nice clear communications, and hopefully my accent won't be too difficult for you folks to understand. So what are we going to look at? Let's quickly look at the agenda. We'll have a brief introduction to BSI, just in case some of you don't know who we are. And then we're going to look through what is the process approach so we understand it, look at scheme requirements, and then we're going to develop a process definition. So we're going to talk through how you would develop a process to define it to meet the requirements of the scheme and to do it so that it's effective for you. And then the process sequence interaction diagram, i.e. how do we join that all together so that we end up with a model of your business. So that's the brief for today. So we're going to start off with a brief introduction to BSI. We've been around a long time. We're a Royal Charter company founded in 1901, so we're a not-for-distributed profit organisation. We were the first national standards body in the world, and we're a founding member of ISO. And BSI has been instrumental in developing over 37,000 standards, including 10 of the top 12 business standards used globally to help companies manage quality, perform better, manage risk, and so on. And you'll be familiar with a lot of those, and I'll cite some of those in a moment. So we're a truly global brand, and we have 3 regional hubs, one in the Americas, 1 in the UK to cover Europe, and a hub in China, and we cover the whole of Asia Pacific. And we operate in about 193 countries around the world, including, bizarrely, the Antarctic. And we have 88,000 plus clients around the world. We've published so far, I think, 37,800 standards. So we help shape, share, embed, assess, and support our clients in making excellence a habit. And that's what we're here for. We provide business assurance, but we help you as our clients to make excellence a habit, which is why 75% of the FTSE 100, 77% of the Nikkei, and 50% of the Fortune 500 companies work with us. So let's look at some of the standards we've helped to write and create. Quality Management Standard, ISO 9001, a lot of you will be familiar with that, but you may not be aware that it started off as a British standard, BS 5750. And of course that is the foundation for AS 9100 series now. So effectively we underpinned the origins of the aerospace standard. And there's the Environmental Management Standard, 14001, which again I know a lot of you will be familiar with, and that started as BS 7750. Health and Safety, which is now ISO 45001, started off as BS 8800. Many of you might have OSAS 18001, and we'll be going through the transition to the 45001 standard. And we have information security, particularly pertinent to aerospace. any aerospace company that isn't looking at information security is, well, frankly, asking for trouble. You really need to be looking at information security. It's a big issue nowadays. I've done quite a few presentations on that. Business continuity, that actually links to information security. And then forward-looking organizational resilience, which is an innovative standard, but it's not a certifiable standard. It's more of a concept, a way of thinking. But it helps glue together everything else that you do. And indeed, the IAQG, the International Aerospace Group, who writes the aerospace standards and manages the scheme, owns the scheme indeed, has adopted organizational resilience, and that has influenced its strategy. So our key streams to support you then: standards. We write standards, and we provide certification to the standards which are for certification. We provide training in a lot of things, implementation of systems, managing systems, internal auditing, lead auditing, and a lot of training in specialist tools such as APQP, which is particularly pertinent now. A lot of the primes are flowing that down in their contracts. So if you're not doing APQP and you're in aerospace, then you may find that you'll be doing it soon, or elements of it, depending on what's flowed down in your contracts. And we have a separate part of BSI which provides consultancy. And then we have product testing, the kite mark symbol, which has been around since 1903. And that provides a symbol of trust. And it's rather better than things like a CE mark, for example. And the best example of the difference I can give you is that a CE mark for a fire extinguisher shows that the fire extinguisher is safe to use. What it doesn't assure you of is that it will put the fire out, whereas a kite mark does. So those are some of the things that BSI does, and some of our clients globally, from all industries. We support a lot of our global clients around the world. So that's an indication of who we are and what our background is. So we'll now proceed with the process approach. So anybody that's involved in aerospace, or anyone that has ISO 9001, will be working to this or working towards this. And let's look at every element. So the process, what is the definition of a process? An activity or a set of activities that uses resources and is managed in order to enable the transformation of inputs to outputs. Now that's important, the inputs to outputs part. So anything which is an input has to have some sort of value-add activity to create it to an output. And that becomes pertinent when people are defining these things, and quite often we see definitions where something doesn't undergo a transition. It doesn't have any value add, therefore it's not an input, it's something else. So the process approach applies a system of processes in the organization, together with the identification and interactions of these processes and their management to produce the desired outcome. So you're creating a value stream, you're mapping your business at the top level, which can be useful in many ways. It can be useful for new people into the organization to understand how it works. It can be useful for top management in discussions with their own management team to figure out how the organization works, how it can change, how it can evolve, how the strategy or context might require changes in the management system. So it has lots of uses inside and outside the organization. And finally, of course, AS9100 is based on the process approach to quality management. So it underpins what we're doing within this standard. So the process approach started with ISO 9001 in 2000. It was written into the standard, but it was not really well understood. It was generally poorly implemented and the benefits not realized. Now the content of ISO 9001, the clause that refers to it, is exactly the same in the aerospace standard. However, because of this poor understanding, poor implementation, and critically the lack of realization of benefits, the IAQG focused on this in the 2009 revision of the ICOP standards, ICOP being the industry-controlled other party scheme, so the aerospace scheme. So they looked at how do we make this system work, how do we make it really effective in aerospace. So the IAQG trained the auditors. It trained those people that implement, or sorry, those people that review the implementation of this standard to make sure the bar was set at the right level. So they shared and promulgated the understanding of the process approach and, more importantly, industry's expectations for the process approach. What did industry really expect to realize from implementing this process approach? And the overall QMS has to meet customer and regulator requirements, as well as the business needs, objectives, and controls of the business. So it has a lot of customers, if you like. This system has to meet the requirements of the business, so that it sets out what the business does, how it's going to do it, shares that information, makes sure everybody in the business really understands it, owns it, responds to it, is engaged. But it has to meet customer expectations, and of course that varies. Depending how many customers you have, you may have quite a few different specific requirements to meet within this QMS, and regulatory requirements. So if you've got Part 21, Part 145 or something like that, or Part 147 even, you need to meet those requirements as well. So it's got a lot to do. So let's look at what the standard says. There's some key words in here which I've highlighted in yellow. First of all, to enhance customer satisfaction. If a system doesn't deliver that, then it's not an effective system. You need to understand and manage the interrelated processes in a system. So it's now setting out that you have to map these things out and understand them, which is why the standard requires that you document them. And you need to contribute to the organization's effectiveness and efficiency. If your QMS is not delivering an effective management system and efficiency, and of course changing the efficiency, you've got to be enhancing that. So the overall performance of the organization has to be enhanced. You can't stand still. If it's not delivering that, then it's not effectively implemented, which means that you haven't understood and implemented the system in the way that it's intended. So the process approach involves the systematic definition and management of processes. So there is a phrase in the UK, I don't have it anywhere else, but it says, if you look after the pennies, the pounds look after themselves. So if you look after the processes in a business, then the overall business, by default, has got to be effective. If each process is effective, and the measurements of effectiveness and the definition of objectives for that process flow down from top management, so if you're looking after it at the lower level, then the overall business has got to be effective in that your raw materials, your products and bits and pieces will come in, your outputs will go out, and they'll go out having been gone through the value-adding process efficiently, effectively, and providing that on-time delivery, product conformity, and customer satisfaction that's the desired outcome of the system. And it prevents undesirable results. So we're talking about cost, we're talking about time, scrap, reworks, etc. And of course, ultimately, non-conforming product or unapproved product. And throughout the organization of your QMS, you need to consider and implement risk-based thinking. The word risk appears in the standard something like 60 odd times, so it's critical to every aspect of how you define this business. So, principles of definition then, you need to have understanding and consistency in meeting requirements. You need to think about value add, the achievement of effective performance. And a process has to be effective, and I'm going to talk about that quite extensively later on, monitoring and measuring of effectiveness of a process. And then the improvement of process is based on the evaluation of data and information. In the modern world, standing still is not an option. Your process, whatever it is, has got to be incrementally improving. Staying the same is not an option. So an example of a process definition, in this case a SIPOC, so you have the inputs, and the sources of an input note can be inside the business or outside the business. And that can apply to any process. And again, I'll talk to that a bit later when we start looking at a process sequence and interaction diagram. But you may have inputs which are internal or external. And the internal ones, that's the internal customer-supplier relationship between processes. That's an underpinning factor or characteristic of the process approach. So you have the sources of the inputs, then you have the inputs themselves, which are usually going to be raw materials or part finished products, that sort of stuff. Then you have the activities, the value-adding element, the outputs. So the inputs have had value add and they become outputs. That could be a product or a service, of course, because the process, the standards, all three standards, talk in terms of product or services as being the outputs. And then you have the receiver of the output, so who does that go to, which could be internal, so the next process in the sequence, or external, which could be the end user customer. Or it might be an external provider, somebody who does an intermediate process, such as heat treatment or surface finishing or something like that. So that's the outline of the process. Okay, so let's look at what the scheme says now. The key and support processes. What does the scheme ask for? So this is what clause 4.4 says. It says determine the inputs required and the outputs expected from these processes. Seems fairly fundamental. What goes in, what goes out. Then look at each of those processes, determine the sequence and interaction of them. So that's saying you monitor or you write down, create your value stream. Determine and agree the criteria and methods, so how you're going to monitor and measure that process, performance indicators, and we're going to talk about that quite a lot later on, so I won't dwell on that now. Look at the resources. Again, I'll unpack that later. Assign the responsibilities and authorities. This is critical because the responsibilities and authorities start to engender the ownership. And ownership is critical to having a system which really works. It's an emotive thing. And you can link that to leadership. So leadership, culture, ownership, those three things really help any system join together. Addressing the risks and opportunities. This is one of the big changes that came in with the most recent iteration of the standard. And risks and opportunities, issues and opportunities. So you have risk, you have risks, a series of risks. You may have at the enterprise level, so management may be looking at it. And you may have them at the process level. So the process, when we're looking at the risks associated with the process. There may also be opportunities. How can we make it more efficient? So those two apply in the consideration and the definition. So you evaluate those and implement any changes needed to ensure the processes achieve the intended results and improve the processes and ultimately the QMS. So that's some standards. You maintain documented information. So maintain documented information, you've got to write it down. You've got to write down this in your quality documentation, whether you include it in a quality manual or whatever you like to call it. Now, if you have a regulatory approval, you may have an exposition document. There is no reason why your exposition document and the aerospace or the AS9100 series quality manual can be one and the same document. If you have them as separate documents, which I see sometimes, then it tends to make any reader, any stakeholder see them as separate. And of course they're not, they're complementary. So if you have a regulatory approval, it's better to write it into the single document. So you shall establish and maintain documented information that includes the scope of the QMS. And scope means the activities, the processes you do, as well as the geographical locations of what you do. And that may be a variety of sites around the planet, and you may have permanent sites, you may have temporary sites. So the scope includes those as well. Description of the processes needed for the quality management system. Now it doesn't say key processes or support processes, it just says the processes. So you need to define the key processes and the support processes, and again I'll cover that a bit later. Sequence and interaction, so how does it all hang together, and the assignment of responsibilities and authorities for these processes. So we're going to sort of work our way through how we're going to meet those things. So key processes, you need to figure out which are the key processes. These are the ones that realize the product or the service. These are your main top-level processes that you as the business owner would need to look at, the process owner would need to really own and manage, and of course your external auditor, hopefully from BSI, is going to be looking at in detail and applying intelligent critical review to those to make sure they meet the standard and to help you evolve them, develop them and improve them. So creating a process definition, we're going to kind of step through this now. So let's start with our old favourite, the PlanDoCheck Act. PDCA model has been around since Pontius was an apprentice, so we're all familiar with that one. In the new standard, they slightly enhanced it, as you can see here. So it shows the continual improvement circle. It's got your processes in the middle, the PlanDoCheck Act cycle that we're all familiar with, and it unpacks those a bit. Activities, controls, documentation, resources, objectives. And then in the bottom right, importantly, monitor and measure for conformity and effectiveness. So we're going to work our way through so we get to that. So the process approach, you have the process in the middle, this set of interrelated or interacting activities, the doing stuff. You have the inputs from the left, the key resources, and the output, the product or service going out from the right. You have the controls, the procedures, what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And then supporting that is the monitoring and measuring. And of course, that's always a cycle. So let's look onto how a SIPOC would deal with that. I don't know why I picked a pizza process. Maybe I'm thinking of my stomach. But let's look at what a SIPOC does. You can use any model. So a SIPOC is a good example. The SIPOC, octopus, IDEF, turtle, etc. I'm going to use two of those later. I'm going to use IDEF and turtle. So in my opinion, a flowchart does not particularly lend itself to a process definition at this high level. It's great for procedures. Indeed, for procedures, I advocate using flowcharts in procedures because you have fewer words, which means they're easier to understand, especially if you have a multilingual organization. You might be operating in a lot of different countries. So if fewer words, a simple flow, it's easier to follow, and actually easier to critique and look at it and say, well, why are we doing that? What value does that add to our process? So the flowchart has its place, but perhaps not in this top-level process definition. So in this, I'm going to use turtle diagrams for the process definitions because that's the IAQG's preferred tool, and indeed it is a very suitable tool for the job. But I'm going to use a thing called IDEF, Integrated Definition, for the value stream. You can use whichever models you like, but those are the ones I'm going to use to demonstrate this. So a process needs to show some key information. It needs to show the metrics in particular, which is why a turtle is particularly useful. Because the SIPOC diagram, as we have here, has suppliers, inputs, process, outputs. It has the customers. It doesn't cover the metrics. So a raw SIPOC diagram doesn't include that key element. And of course, to achieve certification and indeed to get the best out of the system, you need to monitor and measure your process in details. This is an IDEF, a simple IDEF diagram. You have value-adding process in the middle, input from the left, outputs from the right. Controls, it uses the terms controls, which would be your procedures, your regulatory approvals, that kind of thing. And then the resources, which can be the people, tools, the infrastructure, etc., that you need to realize that process. Now, IDEF is quite a good tool. I'm just going to show you in the next diagram how it works. So if you imagine that central box that you can see now, where it says process adding value, that top level box was your entire business. And if that said produce aerospace castings, for example. In IDEF, you then decompose that box down, and any IDEF box breaks down into a maximum of 6. So if you've got the top box on the right, if that's your entire business where it says process name, you can then decompose that down one level into a maximum of 6 processes. So in the aerospace scheme, that would be your top level process sequence and interaction diagram as required by the standard. And I'll show you that later. I'm going to use IDEF for the process sequence and interaction diagram. But that's just an indicator of what IDEF is. It's a tool, it's a piece of software, it's quite a useful piece of software. It was developed, I think, by the US Air Force and then is used extensively by the US Department of Defense. And indeed, in my previous role in the introduction, Anne said that I was in the Army, and one of the things I did was put in place a QMS for the entire technical support of the British Army. So everything in the British Army, whether it's maritime, aerospace, weapons, vehicles, you name it, the QMS for that was modelled using IDEF. So let's look on to cover the value-adding activities, the inputs, the outputs, the who, the what, the how, and the monitoring. So let's look through that. So this is what a turtle diagram looks like. And it's called a turtle because from above it looks like a turtle. So if the outputs are the head, the inputs are the tail, the other four are the feet, in the middle is the body. There you go. Now you know why it's called a turtle. So let's look at what we have in here. Let's start. The middle box, activities. So we're going to create a turtle diagram. Now we can use sales, and the reason I've chosen sales is because it's one that's often done badly. Because writing a process which is making stuff, the manufacturing, is relatively straightforward. But the sales process people get confused with. So if we get this right, then the understanding can be applied to any other process. So the activities in a sales process: quotations, RFQ, bid response, that kind of thing, winning business, order processing, contract review, and order acceptance. Those are the typical things you would see in a sales process. So the inputs, so these will be coming from the customer: an invitation to tender, an RFQ or bid documentation. So those come in, you do the quote goes out. So the output from that line would be the quote. You may have sales leads coming in, and then you'd go out and hopefully win the business. That would be a quote going out as well. Then if the customer likes what you do, then hopefully you'll get a signed purchase order coming in from the left. So you go through order processing, you go through contract review, you go through order acceptance. The order acceptance notification goes out to the customer. The sales order then goes on to the next process into the sequence. So we're now writing something, the sales order, that goes to the internal customer. So you're establishing internal customer-supplier relationship. So the contract review side is pretty important, and we'll talk about resources and how that's affected. So if we look at the top left-hand box, this is the who. It's the personnel resources you need to deliver this process. And the first thing that should be in there is the process owner. And the process owner needs to really own this process emotively. It's critical to anything working that emotion is involved in this thing. He needs to own it. It must be engaged. The owner must know the process inside out. He's got to define it, write it, set the metrics. He's got to own the definition. He's got to revise it as it changes. He's got to make sure that there's driving continuous improvement. Now, we talked about contract review, and this is a good example of how a process goes across departments. A lot of organizations, when you go to audit them for an AS9100, you can see that they've got a superficial documented process sequence diagram and processes, but they still think in departments. And if they still think in departments, they still work in departments instead of working and thinking as a process flow. Now, the example of where this goes across departments is contract review. For a contract review to be done, it needs to involve somebody from each process, or if you wish, department within an organization. So the salesperson couldn't do a contract review without talking to the engineers. Can't accept accept a sales order with a timeline unless he knows from the purchasing department that the raw materials are available on price and can be achieved within the time frame, delivery lead times, that the customer requires. So you can see that every process, every organization, every process, every department needs to be involved in contract review. So that's an example of it going across all departments. So within the top left box, the process owner, he must own it. The personnel, whoever they are, sales personnel for the ITT, the RFQ, the bid docs, and indeed the personnel from all other processes who will probably contribute to the ITT, the RFQ, etc., and also the contract review. Top right is the resources. Now, in the case of a sales process, it's going to be software, ERP package, vehicles, phones, that kind of thing. Of course, if it was the manufacturing process, then you'd be looking at the machinery. What machinery do you need for this process? So there's a different set of things in there. But of course, providing those and making sure they're fit for purpose is part of the process owner's job. So in order to make this as effective and efficient, making sure that it's properly resourced is part of the activity. Bottom left is the how. Now in an IDEF diagram, these would be the controls. So it's the procedures, process forms, the regulations, etc. And the procedures and the forms would be owned by the purchase owner. The regulations come from the regulator. And I've put there they may be inputs. And the reason I say that is that even though they're a control, you could potentially conceive them as being a requirement that isn't met as an input stage, and when it becomes an output, it's a requirement that is met. So compliance with regulations, of course, is important. So in terms of your OTIF, compliance with those regulations is a required deliverable. And then finally, we have the metrics. Now, the metrics get interesting. For a sales process, they're often badly done. Owners tend to create metrics which always look good because it pleases their bosses, and of course it keeps the auditor happy, they might think, if the auditor doesn't apply that intelligent critical review, which is critical to the effectiveness of an audit. Metrics need to be meaningful. They need to really indicate the effectiveness, or not, of the process. So it's likely to be a mix of product and flow related metrics as well as business metrics. So what needs to be monitored and measured? Well, clearly the process owner needs to know what the outputs of the process are and whether they're conforming and whether they meet the needs of the internal customer and the external customer, and that they're delivered on time. So we've got two characteristics there, conforming and on time. And of course, the whole premise behind the AS9100 series is that customers receive product which is conforming, or a service which is conforming, and they receive it on time. So pretty much any process has got to have those somewhere in its metric suite, because if you're not measuring those at the process level, how on earth are you going to deliver them at the business level? But what you can't do is use the overall business OTD and conformity metrics for the process. And that's not information, and because it's a lagging metric. So you can't use it to indicate the effectiveness of the process level. And the IAQG indeed stated that in the 2016 clarifications document, that delivered product OTD are not suitable for process metrics. So let's look at that a bit further. How do we write the metrics? First thing you need to understand is, what's the purpose of the process? Start with understanding the objective of the process. What does it set out to achieve, and what are the business constraints? So if you have a simple sentence, create a simple sentence of what the process is due to do. With sales, it's got to win business with suitable margins. Therefore, you need accurate quotes, promptly delivered. Because when a customer asks for a quote, quite often there's a timeline on it. You can't be late on that. Even if there isn't a timeline, tempo often wins business. If you're the first out there with an accurate quote, you've got a good chance of winning the business. So we're back to conformity and on-time delivery. Convert the purchase order into a sales order. So this is the contract review work. It needs to be an effective contract review. So it needs to be conforming. So the sales order, which goes to the internal customer, needs to be conforming. If it's not, so if your contract review was ineffective, then everything downstream has the potential to be wrong. If you've got the configuration wrong, if you've got some material details wrong, or you haven't identified alternative materials or misread something in that contract review, then your manufacturing phase could use the wrong thing, could use the wrong material, use the wrong hardness, or use an out-of-date CAD model or CAD file, might have the configuration wrong. and you then incur costs with having to rework or even scrap and start again. So effective contract review, how do you measure that? How do you measure it? And probably the best way is to look at non-conformances downstream where the root cause is found to be, well, you should have found that in the contract review. So on-time delivery and conformity of all the outputs. And then, of course, there's going to be a financial element because the business has got to win quotes where, frankly, you're going to make money, because if you're not going to make money, you're not financially stable. And then the top level of the organization, the company's management, is probably going to set metrics for how much business you need to win every quarter, every year, or whatever. So we're talking about business metrics and we're talking about process metrics. So what should or shouldn't feature? Some examples. Purchasing. You need to ensure that conforming materials and services are provided by approved suppliers on time to meet the production plan. So if you're trying to write some metrics for a purchasing process, you need conforming materials or services. You need them on time with the production plan. And you may have something coming down from the top level of the business about keeping overall costs down, holding minimum stock, for example, using JIT or just in time, and of course the pricing. So you've got a financial metric, you've got on-time metrics, and you've got conformity metrics. If you look at production, you need to make the product or deliver the service on time, on cost, right first time. You don't want to be doing reworks. You don't want to be generating scrap. That's non-value add. So you have on-time delivery, again. You have conformity, and you need to decide where you're going to measure that. Are you going to measure that at inspection, i.e. before it goes to the customer? Probably not a good idea to measure it after it's gone to the customer, because that's an escape, so it's too late. So your conformity metric ideally would be measured before release to the customer. And then you've got a cost element, the financial. What's your cost of scrap or rework? And then your efficiency, resource utilization, machine downtime. So machine downtime might come into the top right-hand box of the diagram, the turtle diagram. What resources do you need? The metrics might be the uptime of those machines. And when you talk about risks, you might be thinking about business continuity. What do I do if? So the focus of the outputs should be on the outputs of the process, and that should be outputs to an external customer and to an internal customer. External, if it's something such as a quote or something going out, or a product which is going out to an external provider, a supplier who's going to do some intermediate processing, such as heat treatment or so on. And then the internal conformity and delivery time to the next process in the workflow. So you shouldn't use those on-time delivery to the customer because they're a lagging metric. And again, I'm going to go through examples of that later. It doesn't monitor at the process level. It doesn't prevent escapes, and we all want to prevent escapes. And it can mask a process which is ineffective. You might be doing lots of rework and making large batches, and then the customer gets what he or she wants, but actually your process is totally ineffective because of those reworks and remakes. So by monitoring each step of the process, the product realization value stream, a QMS can provide confidence that the final OTD and conformity to the external customer are met and that each process is effective. Just measuring the as-delivered OTD and conformity does not necessarily indicate process effectiveness. So just as a project has milestones which must be achieved in order to meet the final project end date, so a product realization stream, you should monitor each process step in order to achieve the final OTD. So, I talked about an example. So let's look at this. It's an extreme one, but it makes the point. So a client requires 10 off items. The final metrics show that 10 off conforming parts were delivered on time. So you could assume or imply that each process is effective because the customer at the end got what he wanted. Is that true? Well, let's say that the yield is 10%. So to achieve a 10 off, they start with a batch of 100. So you've got a 90% scrap or waste rate. not good. But that's masked by using the as delivered metric. If they have a rework rate of 15 to 20%, then that's also wasted time, wasted man time, wasted machine time. But it's masked by using the as delivered metric. So they may have to do overtime, extra shifts to get the work done. 90% scrap, 20% rework, huge costs. But using the metrics of as delivered to the customer, it might look effective. But will that business survive with that scrap rate, that wastage rate? Clearly not. So is the process effective? Clearly not. This is why you need to measure it at the process level. So it can mask process ineffective. The QMS is not capable. And I mentioned earlier on APQP. A lot of organizations, primes, are looking at APQP and PPAP. That's about process capability and QMS capability. So if you're not implementing the process approach correctly, you're certainly not going to be able to meet those customer expectations for capability. So that business that we just cited is liable to go broke. So, sales process, the same job. Final metric shows 10 off-conforming parts were delivered, started off with 100. Yields are poor because contract review didn't confirm the configuration. They made several out-of-date parts before correcting it after the first off to the customer was rejected. So it didn't identify the almost impossible to machine internal radius because it didn't have the engineers involved in the contract review. So the contract review didn't identify key characteristics. They might be missed at in-production measuring and at final inspection on the fair 9102 delivery. So all of these are examples where a contract review done badly can lead to downstream issues. So contract review not effective, but using the as-delivered metrics for OTD and conformity, sales looks effective. They might be happily taking their bonus and going down the pub for a couple of orange whips because they've got an effective process, but actually it's hiding the truth. Critical activity of contract review is not being monitored and measured if you only measure the metrics as the value of the business won and the delivered metrics. So again, that business is not going to survive. It's not an effective QMS, not an effective process. And they're also lagging. Process owner, quality manager, top management may not find out about poor quality, bad contract review until a long time later. Customers often, they put things into stock, or they might have a long lead time, or they might have a hold up in their delivery, so things go into stock because they've got a backlog, and you might not find out for a year that you've been making non-conforming product. In the meantime, you've been producing the stuff, putting it into your stock, putting it into their stock, so you could have a massive backlog of non-conforming product held by your client, by your own stock warehouse. So that lagging metric, not only is it going to hide an ineffective process, it can actually cost you a huge amount of money downstream. So a sales process somewhere should have something which looks at the primary outputs, including contract review. How do you monitor the effectiveness of a sale process if you're only measuring business one, but you don't measure contract review errors? I, as an outsider, could not say whether that process is effective. And the process owner, more importantly, couldn't either. So all processes need to demonstrate continuous improvement. And a metric is just a snapshot in time. So last month's performance was green. That doesn't really tell us much about the overall process performance. So when writing your process definitions, also look at how you're going to monitor those metrics. Are you going to have a rolling 12-month window, for example, which shows whether the process is improving, whether it's steady state process, or even whether it's decreasing. So you still might be above your threshold, but if you have a decreasing trend, then you've got a problem. And you want to address that before that decreasing trend goes down below your threshold. And also thinking about the thresholds for your metrics. They need to support your customer objectives. So if your customer is looking for, let's say, 98% on-time delivery, but you have an on-time delivery metric of 80, then your QMS is not designed to meet customer expectations. And remember we said right at the beginning that you need to meet customer requirements as well as the business requirements and the regulatory requirements. So your metrics have to address all of those. What do you as a business need? What does your customer expect and demand, and it's contractual? How does that all tie together? So as the business metrics are set by top management, they must be flowed down to the process owners. Process owners write the metrics to show how they're going to achieve the business metrics and the individual requirements of the process to meet the external customer needs and the needs of their internal customer. So this is the kind of thing you would end up with as a sales process. In the middle, you've got the activities, quotations, RFQ, bid response, winning business, etc. Inputs to the left, which we spoke about before, the outputs, quotes, contracts and bids, order acceptance going to the external customer, excuse me, and then the sales orders going to the internal customer, which is the next process in the stack. In the top left, you've got the who, you've got the what on the top right, you've got the how on the bottom left, and then you've got the metrics. So the first one there is the value of business won. That's liable to be a business metric flowed down from top management. What value do I need you to win to keep this business flowing and growing in the way that we plan? Margins on orders. Similarly, that's going to be flowed down from top management. What is your target gross margin or net margin, whatever they want it to be, but understand what that metric means. Quote turnaround time. This is a tempo, an on-time delivery metric. Winning business requires on you meeting the customer expectations of turnaround time. Sales order accuracy. This is the effectiveness of contract review. That sales order goes into the next process. And you might have a cost version, cost metric for that. No more than 1% cost incurred due to contract review errors. So this is where an example of a set of metrics are meeting the business need, they're meeting the customer need, and the external customer need, but they're also meeting the need of the internal customer. Now, on the report form that an external auditor is going to use is the PEAR, the Process Effectiveness Assessment Report. And one of the boxes is to define the metrics. So when you're writing your process definition, understand exactly what you're saying. When you say OTD, what does that mean? Are you talking about OTD to the original contracted date? Is it OTD to the revised contract date? So every metric you use, fully define it. And quite a lot of companies have a compound metric where they take 2 or 3 parameters and roll it up into a single metric. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as everybody involved understands it. The process owner, the people that are monitoring and measuring the process, that are working to them to try and improve the process, and the process owner. And when it goes into the audit report, that needs to be captured in this box on the PEAR. So every reader, which could be external customers, it might be the accreditation body and so on, anyone can understand exactly what that metric means. So make sure you fully understand the metric yourselves and fully define it. Going on to the process sequence and interaction diagram now, this is how we join it all together now, so we look at the flow. So in essence, you have process A, the outputs of process A going to process B, the outputs of process B going to process C. So that's your customer-supplier relationship, drawing it together. Now what we need to do to meet the requirements of the standard, but more importantly to meet your needs as a business, is show our process sequence diagram. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. I'm just going to take you through a couple of examples. So you could have this, customers on the left, customers on the right, all the activities in the middle, so the bits in red are the core processes. You've got management processes at the top, so they're the support processes, and then the resource at the bottom. So that's an example of how you could do it. And there's no set requirement for how you do it. You do it to meet your needs, but make sure everybody understands what it means. But there are good and bad examples. So let's take these. These are all genuine process sequence and interaction diagrams. So customers on the left, and then the blue boxes are the key processes. Receive inquiry and produce quotation, receive order and do contract review, plan, process, inspect, dispatch. So it clearly shows what the key processes are. It's a bit light on interactions though. So what are the workflows backwards? Because if inspection fails, for example, then it goes back into process. it may go back into plan to plan the rework. So it's a one-way flow. So it shows the process, yes. It shows the one-way interaction, but it doesn't show all the interactions two ways between between the key processes. So it's okay, could be better. This is another example. So customers on the left, customer on the right. Yellow boxes in this case are the key processes, and it shows the flow left to right. It does have sort of an interaction in that there's a line. If you look above the resource requirements box and below the continual improvement box, there's a line there. So you could perhaps interpret that as a backflow. But it's not quite showing exactly what we're expecting. It's okay, but if you think of it in terms of usefulness to you as a business, does that really help you understand all the interactions for the business? So you've got the key processes through the middle. You've got support processes at the top and support processes at the bottom. The trouble with this one, though, is it's got individual procedures. So it's got welding and painting as a separate procedure. It's got quality plans. So it doesn't really engender the ownership in the way that we would hope it could do. So it's okay, but it could be a lot better still. Let's look at this one. This is perhaps a less good example. If we assume, looking at this, that everything in the blue in the middle is a key process, then there are far too many processes. If you're looking at the top level process diagram of an organization, you should be looking at between 2 and 6 really. If you've got more than 6, then you probably have too many. Maybe, but probably around 6 is about where you should be as a maximum. And you remember the IDEF definition, it decomposes any box down into a maximum of 6. And the reason it did that was because it reasoned that the brain can't think about any more than 6 things at a time. I don't think I can achieve that, but that's what they say. So if we look at this box, then there are too many processes in the middle. And this is an example where they've tried to use a flow diagram, a flow chart, rather than a process sequence and interaction diagram. So let's look at an IDEF example, which shows it a lot better. So this is a kind of typical generic process sequence and interaction diagram. So if we look at the top left, you've got sales. You have the input, which is the RFQ, the purchase order, market data, that kind of thing. The outputs. So the output line that goes horizontally along the top, you've got quotes, delivery dates, order acknowledgement, product information going to the external customer. The other output is the sales order, which goes to the internal customer, the engineering and planning section process. The outputs of that, product data, root cards, risks, programs, etc., they go into purchasing, but in parallel goes into manufacture. So the purchasing gets all the engineering information, which would be the BOM, the materials, the lead times, that kind of stuff. They have to acquire the material. So the material data, so that's going to be mill certs, that comes out and goes into box 5, manufacture. So box 5's inputs are from process 4, purchasing, and from process 3, engineering and planning. They then have everything they need. They've got the root cards, they've got materials, they've got the CNC programs, whatever they need, they go ahead and manufacture. Product goes out into inspection. Inspection then measures, monitors that product, and if it's conforming, as you can see, it goes into box 7, which is pack and dispatch, goes back to the customer. So that's the one-way flow. But it also shows the interaction. So if we look at inspection as an example of rework, so that goes back into manufacture to be reworked. It also has a line which comes out of inspection, requirement for rework card. That might go back into engineering and planning. So they have to write a specific router to create the work package to do the rework, whatever that rework might be. And remember, reworks may well require customer approval. So that might also have an output to the customer, which is not shown on this diagram. But you can see the difference. It shows the process flow, it shows the backflows, all the interactions between the key processes. And down the bottom are all the support processes. And these, of course, go into every one of those. So rather than show them individually, It goes into everyone. So the business management system, BMS, clearly that impacts everyone. HR, maintenance and infrastructure. Every process has its infrastructure and resource. IT and IS, that's a critical one. Every business is heavily reliant on the IT systems. Health and safety, human resources, that's the next one. And then finance. So all of those processes are support processes to the others. So that's a good example of a really comprehensive process sequence and interaction diagram. So, summary. Process approach can realize significant benefits if it's well understood and robustly implemented. It generates a positive and collaborative culture. Culture is really important. Leadership is really important. Ownership is really important. Develops the internal customer-supplier relationships and mutual support. I've often seen, going back to organizations that think in a departmental way, the department can be rather insular, the proverbial silo, and can take a view that, well, I'm going to do my stuff. I don't really care about my internal customer. As long as I'm doing what my boss says, and when I go and report to top management, I can show him how good I am. If that's causing problems downstream, not my problem, chief. It's the next guy. So it can actually start creating that kind of blame culture. If you've got an integrated flow where everyone is mutually supportive, and the metrics for one process are written so that they support the needs of the customer and the needs of the internal customer, and you'll get a much more efficient business, a much happier business. You'll have a management team that works together, talks together. When one wants to make a change, to talk to the internal supplier or internal customer and make sure the value stream is integrated. So it keeps those relationships. That leads to benefits in cost, time, and resources. Got to own the process. It's got to be an emotional thing. Take responsibility for it and be empowered. I call it OR, ownership, responsibility, and empowerment. If you implement OR throughout the organization, then you've got engagement of your team. And of course that flows down to every level. The guys that are operating the machines or doing the work within the process, if they have that ownership, that responsibility and empowerment, then if they feel that they are empowered to stop a process, to change things before it goes wrong, that's going to make you a better business. If they feel that they should just be quiet, keep churning out product, whether it's good or bad, that's not good for business. So define each process well. Do it as a team. And I would urge you, if you get a consultant in to help you, make sure they come in to help, not to write it for you. They should be the facilitator. If they come in with a template business model and they just cross out the name of the previous company they worked for and write your name in crayon at the top of each page, that's not a good consultant. They need to sit down with you and help you unpack it, help you understand your business, work your way through it. And the best example I can do of that is not so much a consultant, but one of my roles in quality management in industry. The company I am thinking of, they had a few issues. It wasn't as effective as they wanted to be. The scrap rate was too high. The guys running the teams have been there for a long time, 20 or 30 years in that role. I wasn't a machinist. There's nothing I could possibly tell them about machining. So why would I set out to do that? So when we did the PFMEAs as part of introducing PPAP, I was the facilitator. When we wrote the processes, I was the facilitator. I asked them, what happens next? How does that happen? What is the risk? What could go wrong? Through doing that, we got the engagement of those guys in owning the procedures, in owning the outcomes of their sections, their teams. And we even got benefits in the PFMEA because they came up with the real problems, which they hadn't recognized as being problems. So use your contractor, use your consultant as a facilitator rather than just take whatever he says or she says as the gospel. Work as a team. So make sure the metrics monitor and measure all the important aspects of the process. Know whether your processes are effective or not. Don't hide, don't obfuscate. Don't use metrics which always look good because you think it will keep the boss happy and keep the auditor happy. It won't keep you happy when you go broke. So work through it, and make sure you don't miss out on the benefits. And the process sequence and interaction diagram that helps people understand how the business functions. And that could be new recruits, that could be managers, that could be external customers that are coming to you, potentially looking at you as a supplier. And if you can show them a really well-written process diagram, really well-written process definitions, and of course metrics which show how really good you are, they're going to be confident that you are looking at on time, cost, effectiveness, continuous improvement. So you can use that to win business. So it's got lots of benefits. That shouldn't be in there at all. I think that's...
Nope. Thanks, Brendan.
I think that's your part, Anne, is it?
That is. That
okay.
is our... just a quick,
right. In that case, then, I shall end and hand over to you, Anne.
Great. That is the next slide is our training, what we have coming up. There we are. We have 4 courses coming up in the next 2 months on AS 9100. We also have one on AS 9110, the MRO standard, in Huntsville, Alabama. So we have we're a little bit over, but we have a few questions, Brendan, if you are able to stay on for a second or two.
Yeah, I'm happy to go through those.
Okay, great.
What's the first one?
For a key process, can there be more than one process owner?
I've seen it, but if you have 2 owners, then they have different opinions, and they may cause tensions. And what you really want to do is not have tensions. So it is unusual to have 2 process owners. I would suggest it's probably better. If you've got 2 owners, they're probably doing 2 different things, 2 different sets of activities. So one is probably a customer of the other. So you probably need to break it down to another level and split that into 2 processes. That's the most likely situation there. If you have 2 process owners, either they'll squabble, or when something goes wrong, human nature says one will blame the other. I thought you were doing that. No, I thought you were doing that. So I would suggest it's probably better to break it down into 2.
Okay. The next one is the process metrics are available to auditors and customers through audit reports. How does one avoid financial metrics for proprietary reasons?
Yep, that's easy, because when you talk to the auditor, then you need to share that information. But what the scheme allows is redaction. So there's 2 things. The auditor can write the process effectiveness assessment report, so that details which you don't want to share, financial information for example, don't feature. He can write something in there which just says conforming, so he can avoid putting numbers in, if you like. Also information which, if you want to avoid that going into the public domain on OASIS, although it's not fully in the public domain, but information that goes onto OASIS can be redacted. So the rules of the scheme allow that as well. So you can preserve your dignity in your financial information.
Okay. What idea?
I think the next one is, IDEF is, if I'm not advertising things or recommending it, it's just something I used in the past. If you go to idef.com, it will tell you all about it. It's a range of software. They have IDEF 0, IDEF 1, IDEF 2, IDEF 3. And within that, it talks about which software you can use. To be honest, when I used it, it was in the early 90s, and I can't for the life of me remember which particular package it was. So the diagram I showed you in the slide earlier on, I actually created that in Word or Visio. So the next one is from Nin George. If you have margin on orders as a sales process, then the info would be public information. Yeah, okay, it's the same question about information on OASIS. So that information can be redacted, as I said. And the other thing to bear in mind is that is level 2 information in OASIS. So there are 2 levels of access. Level 1 is the information where anyone can register on OASIS and see the level 1 information on the company, which is their name, address, what they do, what their scope is, and their sites. The level 2 information is all the audit reports. The people that control access to that is the certified organization themselves. So you as the company, you control that access. So there's two elements. When it's being written into a pair, what goes into the pair will be agreed between the CB and the company. It can be redacted, and you control the access to that ultimately. So hopefully that answers that question. The next one is, Ed Gagnon. What's the position on aligning clause number requirements with the process sequence and interaction diagram? You can do. It may be beneficial indeed, some cases, for organizations that are perhaps as not familiar with the standard as others. And as a quality manager, if you want to help your teams understand why they have to do certain things, then you could indeed put them on there. So there are pros and cons. If you think it's beneficial, there is no reason why not. The danger is that if you don't keep it up to date, things might change and applicable clauses might be missed out. So approach it with caution, I would suggest. Next one, Deepika, excuse me, pronunciation. So can KPIs be repeated across two or more key processes? Interesting. I suppose the answer is it depends. So you've got non-conforming product under production and under sales. Non-conforming product under sales. So the product of the sales process is the sales order. So if you had non-conforming product and the root cause was an ineffective contract review, then the metric for the sales process would be the where you have an NCR where that is the root cause. So I think I showed it in the example when we're talking about sales. So non-conforming product as a metric for sales, I would suggest no if you're talking about the end product, because the non-conformance of the activity within the sales process that led to the non-conforming product. If you're talking about the non-conforming product of the sales process, then the product is the sales order or the quote or the RFQ. So I hope that's understood. Do supporting processes require KPIs to be reported? I'm not sure I understand the question, but every process. Oh, sorry, you're talking about the support process. Right, gotcha. They're not monitored by the third-party auditors. But as a business, you might well want to do that, because if you think about infrastructure, there are going to be costs involved in that. But infrastructure, if that's a supporting process, might be linked as a resource in the key process. Because manufacturing, for example, if let's say they're milling and turning, if they've got CNC machines, the resource they need is working lathes, working mills, working grinders. So if the infrastructure is providing the servicing and maintenance to that, then that needs to be effective. So arguably, the manufacturing process is a customer of the infrastructure process. So ultimately, it depends on what you're doing and how these things are mutually supportive. If it adds value, yes, why not?
All righty.
That's the last question, Anne.
Yep, I think that is the last question. Thank you very much, Brendan. We also want to thank our audience for attending BSI's web conference. You can anticipate our follow-up email within the next 7 to 10 business days, which again will include a link to enroll in today's recording. Please do complete the survey to provide feedback and ideas for future webinars. We definitely appreciate your input. And we are running a special on our training courses for February and March, 10% discount on our AS courses as well, which are again on the screen. So thank you again, everyone. Please join us again for our next webinar and look for that on bsiamerica.com/events. Thank you and goodbye.